Have you ever wanted to start a project with yarn that you had in your stash, but you weren't quite sure how much you had? Maybe you were using leftovers from another project, maybe you were using hand spun, or maybe you were using a mystery yarn that didn't have a label at all. Now you could wing it, but that's a great way to lose at the game called Yarn Chicken. Trust me, I've been there, and it's always disappointing. In this video, I'm going to share 6 different methods I have used to estimate the amount of yarn that I had on hand, along with the pros and cons of each. I have to say that I had some pretty strong opinions going into this video about what was going to be the best and the worst method. I was a little bit surprised by the variability and accuracy among all of these methods, but that doesn't mean that one is the best and one is the worst. It just means that there are different ways to do it, and depending on the different tools that you have on hand, one might be better suited to your needs. Hi, I'm Pamela from Fibersprite.com. I help other fiber artists understand what they really need to know so they can get down to their real passion, working with fiber. If this sounds like you, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us get more great content out to you. When it comes to estimating yarn yardage, I've identified about 6 different ways to do it. They are using the Ballband and a little bit of math, using the wraps per inch, using a McMorran Yarn Balance, using another measuring device, such as a Niddy Noddy or warping board, using a yardage meter, and measuring and weighing a small sample. Most of these methods do require a scale, and I use a digital scale for this. You'll also need to do a little bit of math, so be sure to have a calculator handy. The calculator on your phone will work just fine. For this video, I'm using Jamieson's Shetland Spindrift. Since the measurements on this yarn are metric, I'll be working in mostly meters and grams, but switching back and forth between imperial and metric systems as my measuring tools require. This is just one extra step that Americans put ourselves through because we refuse to work in the metric system. Seriously though, I only measure weight in grams because they are more precise than ounces, but some of these measuring techniques do require measurements in inches and give results in pounds. So we'll be talking about yards and meters and ounces and pounds in this video. Do note that none of these are interchangeable. For example, 1 yard is approximately 0.91 meters, or 1 meter is approximately 1.09 yards. 1 ounce is 28 grams. So when you're switching back and forth between imperial and metric, be sure that you're converting things as appropriate so that you end up with accurate measurements. The first method that we're going to talk about is really the gold standard for estimating your yardage. It uses the information provided by the manufacturer on the Ballband to help you estimate how much yarn you have left. For this method, you'll need your yarn, the Ballband, a digital scale, and a calculator. The original ball was 25 grams and approximately 105 meters. What I have left is 9.85 grams, and I want to know how much that translates to in meters. I'm going to plug the 3 known quantities into this equation, which, yep, that's basic algebra there, nothing too scary. Then multiply the original length of the ball of yarn by the remaining weight and the original weight by x, or the remaining length of yarn. Next, we need to isolate x, so we'll divide 1034.25 by 25, and our answer is that we have 41.37 meters of yarn left. Another way to calculate this is to divide the length by the weight. So in this instance, 105 meters divided by 25 grams will get me 4.2 meters per gram. Then I will multiply that by the weight of the yarn I have left, which is 9.85 grams, and that gets me the same result of 41.37 meters of yarn. If I really need to know what this is in yards, I can convert it. 1 meter equals 1.0936 yards, so multiply that by 41.37 and I have 45.243 yards. Both of these methods yield the same answer, so choose whichever one works best for you. Be sure to keep track of this formula. It is the basis for some of the other ones that we are going to discuss later in the video. Now, a quick tip. If you're trying to do this kind of calculation for coned yarn, you're going to want to take into account the weight of the cone itself. I tend to keep a handful of empty cones in my stash for this very purpose. Once you've weighed the yarn on the cone, then you'll weigh an empty cone of a similar shape and size and subtract that weight from the weight of the coned yarn. So for example, this coned yarn weighs approximately 54 grams, but the empty cone weighs about 24 grams. That means I only have about 34 grams of yarn, and taking that into account means I won't run into any nasty surprises later on. Even though using the Ballband or yarn label to calculate how much yarn you have left is the most effective and accurate method for estimating your yarn, it's not always feasible. For whatever reason, you're not always going to have a yarn label. You might have lost it over time, the yarn might have come to you without one, or it might be hand spun that you made yourself and you simply don't know how many yards are there. That is absolutely okay because there are still 5 different methods that we can use to estimate how much yarn we have. The second method has you use the wraps per inch of a yarn to estimate how much yarn you have left. You'll take the wraps per inch, then compare that to a chart to determine the yards per pound. Then you'll use that same formula that we used in step number 1 to estimate how many yards of yarn or meters of yarn you have on hand. For this method, you'll need a wraps per inch tool like the one that we sell, or you can use a ruler. You'll also need a digital scale and a calculator for this method. Now, even though I sell wraps per inch tools and I really love them, I do not recommend them for this method. And in fact, I cringe every time I see them sold for this method. The reason why is that it is wildly inaccurate. Depending on how your wraps per inch tool is used, you can end up with wildly different measurements for the same yarn. For example, I measured this Shetland spindrift at 18 wraps per inch, but if someone weren't familiar with how to use the tool, they might stretch the yarn out and get anywhere from 22 to 26 wraps per inch. And that would vastly change the measurement you'd get for the yards per pound. The second variable is the weight of the yarn itself. Different fibers affect the yards per pound. Even within the category of wool, you'll find that you're likely to have vastly different yards per pound with BFL versus merino, even if the wraps per inch is the same. Going back to my Shetland spindrift, this technique tells me that there are 2,600 or more yards per pound. Since I'm working in metric, I need to convert that to grams and meters. There are 28 grams in an ounce and 16 ounces in a pound, so that's 448 grams. 2,600 yards is 2,377 meters, so that would be 5.1 meters per gram. Multiply that times the weight of yarn that we had left, and that's 50.23 meters in this ball of yarn. Remember that we calculated 41.37 meters, so that's a difference of 8.86 meters, or a whopping 21% difference. The third technique is to use a McMorran Yarn Balance to determine the yards per pound. For this technique, you'll need a McMorran Yarn Balance, a ruler in inches, a scale, and a calculator. The McMorran Yarn Balance is a tool where you place your yarn on the hook of the balance. When the balance hangs parallel to the floor, you have the right amount of yarn. You then measure that in inches, multiply that number by 10, and that gives you the estimated yards per pound. In this example, I had 19.5 inches for 1,950 yards per pound. Then I went through the same math as before to arrive at an estimated 3.98 meters per gram. I multiplied that by the weight of the yarn I had left, 9.85 grams, to get 39.2 meters. This was about 2.37 meters less than what we originally estimated, or a difference of 4%. One big downside to using the McMorran Yarn Balance is that you have to cut your yarn, and you often need to snip off these little pieces in order to get it to level out. So you have some wasted yarn, which is a big deal if you only have a little bit of yarn left in the first place. Plus, you have to buy an extra tool. However, it is really useful for working with large amounts of mystery yarn and getting a quick estimate, and it's fairly accurate. The fourth technique is to use a Niddy Noddy, warping board, or some other tool that you wind your yarn around. A ruler and a calculator will also be helpful with this method. The key to this technique is that you know the distance that your yarn travels around the tool, and then you count the number of rotations to get the total length of your yarn. In this example, I wound the yarn around a 2-yard Niddy Noddy. I made 25 revolutions for an estimated 50 yards or 45 meters. This is 3.63 meters longer, or 10% more than our original estimate. So that's a little bit much of a variability, but there is a way to correct for some inaccuracies in this method. As you wind the yarn around your Niddy Noddy or warping board, you're stretching it just a little bit. After taking it off your tool, you can measure it against a ruler to get the relaxed length. Here, I measured that the length of the skein was 31 inches, which I then doubled for a total of 62 inches. Then we run that through the math again to get an estimated 39 meters, which is 2.37 meters or 5% less than our original estimate. That's a much more accurate number, and I would feel comfortable working with this number, especially if I didn't want to do a lot of math. One downside to this technique is that you're going to have to wind the yarn back into a ball after it's done, so you add an extra step there, and every time you wind and unwind your yarn, you do risk adding some tangles and abrasion to the yarn. So it's just something to be aware of. The fifth technique is to use some sort of yardage meter along with a ball winder. You can buy these specifically for yarn or for fishing line. Mine is attached to a fancy bobbin winder, but you can buy these for about $10 or $20 on their own and use them as you wind a ball of yarn. As I wound the yarn over the meter, I was careful not to stretch it too much. As with the Niddy Noddy technique, you do run the risk of stretching the yarn and getting a distorted outcome. My meter gives its output in tenths of yard, and I got a reading of just shy of 46 yards, or 42 meters. Of all the techniques I tried, this was actually the closest to our original estimate, only 0.63 meters over, or 2% more than our original estimate. The last technique is to measure out a known quantity of yarn, such as 10 yards or meters of yarn, and then run through the original math that we did in step 1. Since I was using a very accurate scale, I measured out 1 yard of yarn and went through the original math that we did in step 1 to find that I had 3.95 meters per gram, or 38.97 meters in the ball of yarn I had left. That was 2.4 meters or 6% less than the original estimate. Note that the less accurate your scale, the larger your sample size should be for accuracy. So which method of estimating your yarn yardage or meterage is the best? It really depends on the tools that you have available and how much math you're willing to do. For me, if I have the yarn label available, I will always use the first method since that's the most accurate and it's pretty easy to do. However, if I've lost the label or if I'm working with hand spun, I usually use any number of the other 5 techniques. But I don't use the wraps per inch technique because that is the least accurate and has the most room for error. If you found this video helpful and want to dive deeper into the topic, be sure to check out my blog post at fibersprite.com. It's linked below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.